My motif is grandfather's advice, as shown in Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and grandfather's advice is supposed to represent the wisdom that is going to guide Invisible Man back onto the right path as he journeys from the south to the north and finding his identity. However, it's shown in the very beginning of the book that because Invisible Man misinterprets his grandfather's advice and is confused over his advice throughout the course of the entire book, that he is set out on a treacherous journey, just as grandfather forewarns him of on page 17. Certainly the most important advice that grandfather gives Invisible Man is shown in the very first chapter, before Invisible Man really starts his journey anywhere, before he even goes to college. And it's on page 16. He says, "I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree 'em to death and destruction, let 'em swallow you till they vomit or bust wide open." And then on page 17, grandfather kind of contradicts what he says by saying that this lifestyle is defined as treachery. And this is what sets Invisible Man out on an entire course of being lost, because he misinterprets grandfather's advice. Grandfather is saying that, yes, you have to agree with the whites and you have to please them in order to make it through society, but if you conform too much, it's treachery because you're going to self-efface yourself and you're not going to be able to find your identity if you're so worried about conforming to everybody. And Invisible Man focuses on the very first part that grandfather says, yes 'em to death and undermine 'em with grins. However, he completely throws away the fact that grandfather said that living this way was treachery for him. And because he doesn't take that seriously and he doesn't see that lifestyle is treachery, he lives the exact same lifestyle and experiences the exact same downfalls that his grandfather was warning him against. So grandfather's advice is not always given by grandfather. Sometimes it's given by grandfatherly figures that appear throughout I.M.'s journey. And one example is when he's on his way to New York from college and he's on the bus, and the vet that he met in the Golden Day is now on this bus sitting next to him giving him grandfatherly advice. So I.M. is telling the vet that he's very excited to go to New York because it's a dream and it's going to be somewhere that he can make a lot of money and be very successful. And the vet is saying that he needs to look at the bigger picture, that he needs to keep his eyes wider open because he is so caught up in this dream that is New York. And he's saying, and the vet tells I.M. that's not a place, New York. It's a dream. And he's not saying it's a dream, like a wonderful dream. He's saying it's not reality. It's not something that is really obtainable, the success that I.M. believes he's going to obtain in New York. On page 153, the vet tells I.M., "Come out of the fog, young man, and remember you don't have to be a complete fool in order to succeed. Play the game, but don't believe in it." Then on page 154, he tells I.M. again, "They wouldn't see you because they don't expect you to know anything, since they believe they've taken care of that." So essentially, the vet is saying, yes, you can please them and you can yes them to death, just as grandfather said originally, but don't be a fool. Don't yes them to death so much that you don't even know what you're agreeing to. You have to play the game, he's saying, by saying be knowledgeable on your own and maintain your own identity, be yourself. And you can play the game too, just make sure that you know what your own agenda is and you're not only fulfilling their agenda. And this is important advice because I.M. is on his journey to New York and he's about to open up to a whole new world. And he has this mindset that he wants to imitate Bledsoe, Dr. Bledsoe, and everything that he does. And so this advice from the vet is grandfatherly advice that is the intention of it is to lead him back on the right path. However, that is not what ends up happening, because right when I.M. gets back into New York, or not back into New York, when he arrives in New York, he already sees all the briefcases that the people are holding and he notices all the money. And he gets into the hotel room and he shoves the Bible in the chest drawer, and he's already putting away all of the good influences in his life, and he's looking at all of the greedy and the materialistic things. And that's kind of the whole point of the grandfatherly advice throughout the book, is that it's continually there. It's there every other page, but I Am ignores it constantly. And it's supposed to guide him on the right path, but I Am later learns that he had to take a bajillion steps forward and a bajillion steps back. And there was a lot of advice given to him that he never listened to, but eventually it helped him. The third example of grandfatherly advice used as a motif in Invisible Man is on page 170. So when Invisible Man has already spent some time in New York, and now he's laying in his bed, and he says, "But that night I dreamed of my grandfather and awoke depressed. I walked out of the building with a queer feeling that I was playing a part in some scheme which I did not understand. Somehow I felt that Bledsoe and Norton were behind it, and all day I was inhibited in both speech and conduct for fear that I might do or say something scandalous. But this was all fantastic, I told myself. I was being too impatient. I should just wait for the trustees to make a move." So this is showing that he has a dream of grandfather, but he completely ignores it. He instead goes directly back to the path he was on in using the recommendation letters to find a successful career in New York. And grandfather appears in his dream in order to guide him back on the right path. He has this premonition of what does later happen in a few pages when he finds out that Dr. Bledsoe wrote all these letters, which would lead to his downfall by saying that nobody should hire him and nobody should let him be successful. But he ignores this premonition, and then he walks right into the booby trap of Mr. Norton and Dr. Bledsoe later. And this shows that every time I Am is given grandfatherly advice, he thinks he knows better. He thinks that his lack of worldly knowledge and small amount of wisdom is going to somehow get him through life, but it's not. And that's why grandfather keeps appearing, but it is only beneficial to I Am if he will listen to it. The fourth example of grandfatherly advice given to Invisible Man is shown when Invisible Man is with Brother Tarp, and he's looking into the portrait of Frederick Douglass. This is on page 378 and 379. And it says, "I sat now facing the portrait of Frederick Douglass, feeling a sudden piety, remembering and refusing to hear the echoes of my grandfather's voice. Then I picked up the telephone and began calling the community leaders." So the context of this is that Invisible Man has just joined the Brotherhood, and now he's going to do some work for them to call community leaders about the eviction that has just happened, the rally that has just happened. And he is thinking about what he's going to do next. And Brother Tarp is saying that all you have to do is look into this image of Frederick Douglass, and you will realize what your purpose is. Now, Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist leader. He wanted integration, and he's almost like a religious leader for African Americans. He was very prominent in the abolitionist movement. And Invisible Man is looking into his portrait, and he feels piety. Piety is like obedience, and he's looking at his portrait, and it's almost like he feels inspired to now go obey the Brotherhood because he sees this leader. But the Brotherhood is completely misleading him because they're a communist group. They want to create a communist environment, but they're using Invisible Man as almost a figurehead in order to, or like as a conduit to reach the black community. And so they're using Frederick Douglass to inspire Invisible Man for their own agenda. And so Invisible Man feels obedience for the Brotherhood. But grandfather's voice comes into his head, and it's saying probably not to do this work for the Brotherhood because it's not in his best interest, in Invisible Man's best interest. But Invisible Man, like he always does, ignores grandfather's advice, and it says he refuses to hear the echoes of the voice. And so he pushes aside grandfather's advice, and he continues the work for the Brotherhood. And he just falls right down back the rabbit hole. And this is what he does every time. How grandfather's advice ties into the main theme of the book is shown in the epilogue on page 580. And Invisible Man has now realized what grandfather's advice really meant, as mentioned in the first chapter, when he got confused about what Grandfather was telling him to do. An Invisible Man says, "Perhaps that makes me a little bit as human as my grandfather. Once I thought my grandfather incapable of thoughts about humanity, but I was wrong. Why should an old slave use such a phrase as this and this or this has made me more human, as I did in my arena speech? Hell, he never had any doubts about his humanity. That was left to his free offspring. He accepted his humanity just as he accepted the principle." And I am has now learned that the principle is which is kind of a main theme of the book, is that life is to be lived, not to be controlled by the pleasing of others, the others being mostly white people. And now Invisible Man has finally realized that Grandfather in the beginning said yes, and yes, the white people to make them happy and please them and get them to grin, but don't conform so much that you lose your identity. And that is the principle, that you need to live your life as yourself and not be controlled because you're so focused on conforming with other people.